Now, I'm going to be brief in introducing this incredible panel that we've got, and I just want to say that I feel an extra special bond with each of these two people. With Ann Hull, because I've known her for 30 years, since we were both young people together on the St. Petersburg Times. I was a young reporter, and Ann was a young copy aide. And it has been incredible to watch her become such a force in journalism, first at the St. Pete Times, then at the Washington Post. Had a brief detour into cosmetics sales when she was very young. Fortunately, came back to journalism. Ultimately won a Pulitzer Prize with our friend Dana Priest, another St. Pete Times alum. We all work, by the way, for the great Gene Patterson, who many of you in this room know, who we lost earlier this year. Now, Robert Caro, I feel a special bond with him, even though I've known him for fewer than 30 minutes. And that is only partly because of the bond I feel as a consumer of his work, which is the deep dive of all deep dives. And if any of you have read his books, and I suspect many of you have, you cannot stop reading them once you start. It's the greatest political biography set that I know about. But the other reason for the bond that I feel with him is that the Harwood family has also contributed to the oeuvre of Lyndon Johnson biography. Now, if you took Robert Caro's books and stacked them, they would be about as high as this podium, because they're all long. They read short, but they're long. My family's contribution is this little volume, 182 pages, written by my dad and his Washington Post colleague, Haynes Johnson. And the difference between this stack and this is the difference between working on a set of biographies over 5 decades and the 5 weeks that Dad and Haynes spent on this book. This was the first book that was done as the Washington Post was trying to branch out into book publishing. They had made a deal with the publisher, and they were going to pay their reporters to produce Washington Post books, and this is the first one. Now, interestingly, I was recently going over some of my dad's papers from his time at the Post and came across an exchange of memos, which was provoked when Dad and Haynes learned what they would be paid for producing the first Washington Post book. And I'm not kidding, it was $36 each person after all these different cuts were taken out. And there was an exchange of memos that finally ended up with one from Ben Bradley to Dad. And it said, "I've talked to Mrs. Graham. We understand that this is wrong, but sorry, there's nothing we can do about it." And I only say that to put the room in a good mood, since we all know that no news organization today would ever screw people out of money that way. I give you Ann Hull and Robert Caro.
Can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So when Anne Marie asked Bob and I to do this some months ago, we didn't know that we both have the same employer, which is Amazon. But here we are. And Bob is asked often about LBJ and politics and money, and we'll get into some of that. We're going to have maybe 20, 25 minutes at the end for you guys to ask questions. But because he's speaking to journalists, he wants to talk, and I think it's a great idea to talk a lot about his process and how he gets what he gets. So why don't we just start from, how did your training as a journalist at Newsday and prior to that, how did that prepare you for a life as a biographer, a historian?
Well, there's really not that much difference between it. I'll take one example. I was thrown into investigative reporting when I really knew nothing about it. I was about 23 years old. And I told my editor that I didn't know anything about it. And he said, just never assume a damn thing. He said, turn every page. Well, when you get down to the Johnson Library, that's really what I try to do. I told Ann before, when you get down to the Johnson Library, you go in, and the bottom floor is a museum, and you go around a corner, And there's this huge marble staircase, very broad and high. And at the top of it is a glass wall 4 stories high. And behind that, and you see all these boxes there, they're all bound in red buckram, and they have the presidential seal in 24-karat gold. And they are the papers of Lyndon Johnson, and they go back, I don't know how long. It seems to me as long as a football field, but it's not. And the last time that they released the figure, they said they had 44 million documents there. So you can't actually even think of turning every page. It would take many lifetimes. But when I was doing the first volume, which was about Lyndon Johnson as a congressman, I realized that I can't remember, if I'd known you were going to ask this, I can't remember the number of boxes that dealt with his congressional career. And it was manageable. And I said, well, I'm going to do what I was taught and turn every page in there. And it's because I did that. People are always asking me, how did you find out? Am I going on too long?
Please.
People are always asking me, how did you find out about how Lyndon Johnson used money in his political career? You know, there's a point, those of you who have read the books, and if you haven't, the test is Tuesday. But there's a point where Johnson suddenly gets national political power. He's a junior congressman. He's in his 3rd year in Congress. It's October 1940. Before that month, when Johnson writes a committee chairman or another senior member of Congress, he's writing in the tone of a junior to a senior, very deferential, can I have a few minutes of your time? All of a sudden, in November 1940, it's the other way around. These senior congressmen are writing him, can I have a few minutes of your time? So I was asking all the people who remembered Johnson at that time, what happened in October 1940? And one of them, a guy named Thomas J. Corcoran, who was a political fundraiser and fixer who was spending a lot of time with me, said, I asked him what happened in October 1940, and he said, money, kid. He used to call me kid. Money, kid, money. He said, but you're never going to be able to write about it because, I said, why? And he said, because Lyndon Johnson never put anything in writing. And of course he was right. I knew what he had explained to me. Johnson was a political genius. And he had thought of something. Although he was a junior congressman, there was one thing he had that no other congressman had. He was the only congressman who knew the big Texas oil men and contractors who wanted all these favors and contracts from the government. And they were reactionaries. They were the Texas regulars. They hated Roosevelt. But they wanted things from government and were willing to give campaign contributions to get it. And he also knew all the liberal northern congressmen who needed campaign contributions. He persuaded the Texas oil men to give money only through him, and it became known in Congress that you had to go to him to get money, and that's what's happened. But I thought I was not going to be able to write about that in any detail. And then I was going through, I just said, well, I'm going through all these boxes, and there are all these file folders that seem to have nothing to do with anything you're interested in. And I was going through one which had nothing, the label seemed to have nothing to do with, and all of a sudden there was a telegram from George Brown of Brown and Root, which was the firm that was really financing most of this. And the telegram began, I still said it's a yellowed piece of paper, saying, Lyndon, hope you received the checks. And there was and down in the bottom, somebody, I think it was John Connolly, had written who the checks were from. And you were able to find, so that was how the money got there. And I was going through other boxes, and all of a sudden I came across a list. And it was a list that was compiled by John Connolly. John Connolly was Lyndon Johnson's administrative assistant. And the list contained 3 typed columns. The left-hand column was the name of the congressman who had asked Johnson for money. In the center column was what he had asked Johnson for money for. Lyndon, if I just have one more round of ads, I can win this. Lyndon, we need poll watchers. They're trying to steal the election, Lyndon, whatever. In the third column was how much the congressman had asked for. The amounts were so small then, $1,000 or $1,500. But in the left-hand margin, Lyndon Johnson had written something in his own handwriting next to each name. So against some of the names it said, okay. And I asked Connolly what okay meant. He said that meant that Johnson was giving the amount the congressman had asked for. Against some of them it said okay with an amount. That meant he was giving him part of the money, 500 instead of 1,000 or whatever. Sometimes in that left-hand column, Johnson had written no, which meant he was giving no money. But sometimes he had written no out. And I asked John Connolly, what did no out mean? And he said, that guy was never going to get money. You never crossed Lyndon Johnson. So, you know, you say, what did I learn as a reporter? How does that translate into the books? You say, if I hadn't been doing that simple thing, trying to turn every page, I never would have found that out.
Back it up, because it takes a lot of work to get to that box with that one document. So back up the process a bit. You were fascinated with Robert Moses, the power broker. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to seize on him as your first big subject of a biography? You were a Nieman then in 65, 66.
Yes.
How did you spend your year here?
Well, I spent my year here. The wives were invited to more social events then, but Ina's mother was very sick that year, so I was often up here by myself. And I don't like to go to social things by myself, so we all had offices then. And what I was thinking about, I had been covering politics in New York, and it had gradually sunk in on me that although we all believed, including me, you know, that power comes from being elected. Here was a guy who was never elected to anything, and he had more power than anyone who was, more than any governor, more than any mayor, more than any governor and mayor combined. And he had held this power for 44 years. And I had no idea where this power came from. And I was supposed to be writing about political power. And I had been thinking, that had come, I realized that when I was at Newsday. And I was gotten interested in Robert Moses. And the reason I was coming up here was to learn more about urban planning and all, which I didn't know anything about. But when I spent a lot of evenings thinking, and what I realized was I couldn't possibly do this in the context of daily journalism. I would have to do a book. So I wrote a book proposal, and that's got the world's smallest contract. And that's what I did.
And you pursued this at great personal cost. You and your wife ended up selling your house to subsidize this project.
Yes.
How did you come to that decision and to have that, to pursue something at that cost?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, part of it was simply I had no idea how long it was going to take. So the contract was too small. We didn't really have, you know, I was a reporter. We didn't really have any savings to speak of.
Yeah.
So I couldn't quit. So for some months I was trying to start the book while I was still at Newsday. And I wasn't getting anywhere, you know, at all with that. And then I heard there used to be this wonderful grant they gave. It was called the Carnegie, the Carnegie Corporation, Carnegie Foundation, the Carnegie Fellow in Journalism at Columbia University in the journalism school. And what they did was they paid one reporter at a time his salary for 1 year, gave him an office there while he wrote a book. And I was sure I could finish this book in this year. In fact, I told Ina we had always wanted to go to France. So I said, oh, I have this schedule. I'm going to be done in 9 months. We're going to get 3 months in France. But at the end of the year, of course, I had hardly started, you know. And, you know, we were really broke. And I came home one day and Ina said, I sold the house today. This was before the real estate boom. So we hadn't paid very much for the house, but after selling it, after the mortgage, we cleared $25,000 some dollars. So that was enough to live a year. But then I was still only, you know, starting. So when you ask about that, you really say it was, you know, it was years of being broke until then I got a different publisher, because my first publisher wasn't really interested in the book. And then it got easier for me.
Okay. And so the Power Broker published, and how did you then seize on Johnson as a subject? He seems delicious, it's like a delicious no-brainer now. He's partly House of Cards is partly based on this character LBJ. The ART is sold out at a play right now about LBJ. But back when you decided, it was not in vogue, or he wasn't an approachable biography subject. So why LBJ?
Well, okay, I never thought of The Power Broker as being a biography of Robert Moses.
Right.
I never had any interest in writing a book just to tell the life of a great man. I wanted to tell about how political power worked in the cities, in New York and really all the cities of America, how urban political power worked. That's what The Power Broker is supposed to be. And I realized that's what I wanted to do, and I had thought while I was doing the Moses book that if I could ever do another book, you have to pick the right man. Like Moses had thought of ways to get power that nobody had thought of before. That Johnson was the right, I wanted to do national political power, and Johnson was the right man to do it because he made the Senate work. That was the thing I first focused on when he was majority leader. The Senate actually worked and created legislation. Hard to believe, but it's true. You know, before, in the 100 years before Lyndon Johnson, the Senate, since the days of Webster, Clay, and Calhoun, which was back in 1840s and 1850s, the Senate was the same dysfunctional mess that it was today. Johnson becomes majority leader in January 1955, and for 6 years the Senate works. It is the center of governmental energy and creativity and ingenuity in Washington. They write their own bills. The Civil Rights Bill of '57 is Johnson's bill. It's not Eisenhower's bill. Johnson leaves to become vice president, and in one instant, the Senate is back in the same mess that it is and has continued to this day. So you say if you could figure out how Johnson did it, what did he do that no one else did before or since, then you'd find out something about how power really works in Washington. That was what first drew me to him. So anyway, I'm sorry I went off on that. But so I wanted to do Johnson. That's why I wanted to do national political power.
And you and Ina ended up moving out to Texas.
Yes.
To both go into this 4-story library of Johnson's, and also you spent time in a tent trying to figure out what a Texas night is like. Can you tell us about some of the reporting?
Just a sleeping bag.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay. Tell us about just the initial, how you approach that kind of reporting. That's a huge building, and there are many people still living at that time, I guess, who worked with Johnson when you first began.
Yeah, the great thing was, you know, he had died so young. He
Yeah.
died in 1973, and I was starting this book in '76. So the people who grew up with Johnson, if you went to Johnson City, which is and you say his best friend was Truman Fawcett. Truman Fawcett lived on the other side of the courthouse square. Truman Fawcett was still living on the other side of the courthouse square. If you say Lyndon Johnson's first girlfriend was Kitty Clyde Ross, well, now she was Kitty Clyde Leonard, but she was still living in Johnson City. So the people he went to college with were his own. You could interview all of them, just about. They were all the people who were his first political machine. So you were able to interview all these people. So what I was doing, I said there were already 7 Johnson biographies had been published, and there were a lot on his youth. So I thought everything, you know, that was basically done. I didn't think they had enough color in it, but I would add to that by interviews. So what I would do is every day, I'd work in the library from 9 to 5. That's when it closed.
The Johnson Library.
And
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I would work in the Johnson Library from 9 to 5, and then I'd drive out into the hill country to interview one of these people. And I came to realize that there was something that they weren't telling me, you know, over and over again. You know, they're very different kind of people from North. There's a real kind of honesty there, but a reverence for government. They weren't going to say anything bad about a president of the United States. And they had seen reporters come, you know, they called them portable journalists. I mean, ever since Johnson's presidency, these reporters would come down for a week and go back and write the true story of the hill country or the true story of Lyndon Johnson. So I finally said to Ina, you know, I'm not getting through to these people. I don't understand them, and I don't understand the hill country, so I don't understand Lyndon Johnson. So I said, we're going to have to, how do you feel about moving?
We're gonna have to. How do you feel about? Yeah.
So Ina said, why don't you do a biography of Napoleon? But of course, she said yes, and we rented a house, and for 3 years, we were probably there 8 or 9 or 10 months of each year. And as soon as the people, this is what's so interesting, I mean, there's no difference between really doing a thorough reporting job, whether it's for a newspaper or a book. As soon as the people realized that we were living there, that we had come to stay to try and understand them, the interviews became different instantly. And they started to tell me all the stories about Lyndon Johnson, terrible stories about his ruthlessness when he was young and all. And then you came to understand that the hill country was a big part of him. I was a city boy, you know. And they tried to explain to me, you know, say, I remember his cousin Ava, his favorite cousin, who I became great friends with, saying to me, you know, you're a city boy. You don't understand the land. And if you don't understand the land, you're never going to understand Lyndon Johnson. Well, I thought that was like some grade B Western. I said, this is really terrible. But then she said, I'll show you what I mean. So she took me out to the Johnson Ranch. And those of you who've read the book know that the central thing in Johnson's life was that his father, who he idolized, went broke and lost the Johnson Ranch. And the reason he went broke was he thought that the ranch could support a certain amount of mortgage because it would grow a certain amount of cotton. He didn't understand that there was what the land was like. And she took me out there and she said, now get out of the car and kneel down and put your fingers in the ground. And if you walked out, I mean, this grass was growing and it looked like ordinary. But when you stuck your fingers in the ground, they wouldn't even go down to the end of your finger because there was almost no soil there. It's rock underneath. So that what that meant was one crop of cotton, and you couldn't grow. Basically, I'm oversimplifying. You couldn't grow anymore. She said, you see, you can't make a mistake here. This isn't like a city where there's safety nets and things. Out here, if you make a mistake, you lose your home. And I suddenly thought about Lyndon Johnson, how he was the greatest vote counter in the Senate. You know, if you go down to the Johnson Library, one of the fascinating things you see is the very tally sheets in the Senate when he was majority leader. And they're long, those of you who have seen them, they're long, thin pieces of paper with 96 and then 100 named down the center. And on each side, there's a blank line, so you can write the number of check mark on which side they're going to be on a bill. When you look at these tally sheets, they're smudged. The pencils marks are smudged. And the reason they're smudged, I find out, is that Lyndon Johnson would go down these sheets. That was his thumb mark. And his thumb wouldn't move on to the next senator until he knew how the senator would vote. And he would say to his staff, you know, he'd send his staff out to talk to senators. They would say, I think he's going to vote this. And Johnson would just become infuriated. He said, what good is thinking to me? I have to know. And he never lost these votes, never lost a close vote. And I thought back to, you can't make a mistake in life. That's, you know, that's part of what made Johnson what it was. So this whole thing all is one continual process to me.
You were an oddity to them, just as you probably were really strange to them.
Yeah.
It's said that you still go to work in your office in a suit and tie because it gives you the impression that you're working.
Yes.
Did you wear a suit and tie doing that reporting in the Hill Country?
No.
Okay. Tell us about your dealings with Lady Bird Johnson.
Well, let me say, first of all, she really hated my books. But there was a time at the beginning, you know, where she spent a lot of time with me, was very helpful. She's a very smart person. And what she would do is, I would see her each Saturday, and she would take, I forget what you call them, desk calendars, you know, when you have a page for each day and you keep it on your desk. And she would go through each year, and she's, oh, I see we had dinner with Sam Rayburn at Hall's. I remember we talked. So she was really, really helpful to me while she was talking to me. She was also a very cautious person, as I think I mentioned to you. I came home and told Ina once, boy, I just spent 4 hours with someone and not one word was going to pass her lips that she didn't intend to pass her lips.
And how did the relationship change?
With me?
With Lady Bird?
Well, I never knew why. It wasn't anything I wrote because, well, I feel I do know why, but I don't know it. Long before I published anything, she and all the Johnson people stopped talking to me. I think if I want to put it in a complimentary way to myself, but I don't know that this is true, I was looking into this story of how Lyndon Johnson got started by obtaining federal money and authorization for a dam that Brown and Root was building down in the hill country. And it's quite a story. I mean, I thought it was quite a story. And I was talking to George Brown of Brown and Root and Abe Fortas, who was then the young lawyer at the Interior Department, and all the people involved in this. And then they had a gathering at the Lyndon Johnson Library, and there was a picture on the front page of the Austin American-Statesman, and there George Brown and Abe Fortas and John Connolly were all talking together. And I said, oh, all my sources are talking to each other. And right about that time, everyone stopped talking. I always felt, someone said, I saw this guy, Robert Caro, was writing a book. I told him so-and-so, and Abe Fortas said, I told him so-and-so. And the realization must have come that between it, I knew the whole story. I think no one had ever, I think they weren't prepared, if I wanted to compliment myself, for someone really looking into these stories that Johnson had told all his life.
What was the relationship with the press and Johnson back then? You know, Philip Graham, who ran the Washington Post, wrote speeches for Kennedy, then started helping Johnson. Can you talk about Johnson's relationship with the media in general, and also Kay Graham and Philip Graham, and how that might have shaped his policies?
Well, with the media in general, that's, you know, it changes very dramatically. When Johnson came into the presidency, he came in on this wave of good feeling. Everyone wanted him to succeed because Kennedy had been assassinated. And he passes Kennedy's civil rights bill, gets all Kennedy's legislation moving, starts the war on poverty, wins against Goldwater, what is the largest popular majority in history. So at the end of 1964, his relationship with the press, you would say, was adoring the president. By the middle of 1965, Lyndon Johnson is really distrusted, disliked. The term credibility gap has already been coined. And Life magazine has a cover story, the president's feud with the Washington press corps. So how did all this change in 6 months? Johnson, you know, Johnson had a real problem with the truth. I mean, in college, his nickname was Bull Johnson, which for the, and he didn't seem to realize that now that he was president, the things that he said were going to be checked. And the press got to realize this, and a lot of it had to do with he was escalating the Vietnam War. It would take forever to go into this, so I won't do it today. And he was basically, James Reston wrote, the United States entered a land war in Asia yesterday in secret. You know, he thought he could do this without people realizing what he was doing. So the distrust grew. But on the other hand, you mentioned Mrs. Graham, if I can tell another side of this story. So this was a really interesting story. I had written my first volume, and it was at a birthday party for a friend of mine, Arthur Schlesinger, at the Century Club. And afterwards, everyone's standing around talking. And Ina comes up to me and says, you know, there's a woman behind you who I think is waiting for a chance to talk to you. So I look over my shoulder and I said, I don't think so. That's Catherine Graham. But in fact, she was. And she came up to me and she said basically, you know, something very complimentary about my book. And she said, but you haven't talked to me, you know. And I said, well, I'm really not up to that point. And she said, well, you know, I want to make sure that, I can't remember her exact words, but it was that you understand how important Philip was in changing Lyndon Johnson's views on civil rights. Mm. And of course, I knew that already. And I said, well, you know, I'd like to talk to you about it. They were remarkable interviews because, for one thing, I don't think I've ever talked to anyone quite as determined. She wasn't interested in talking about herself. She wanted to talk to me so that her husband, who had by then died, got the credit he deserved for getting Johnson to push the first civil rights bill, the 1957 bill, since Reconstruction. And of course, I knew that that was true. There's a wonderful memo from Philip Graham, which I can't remember the wording, but it's basically, if you want to have a chance in 1960, 1957 is when you have to pass the civil rights bill. And Johnson listened to him. But the thing with that is so great was Catherine Graham as a reporter. So somewhere along this, I had heard, because my publisher is Knopf, which is part of Random House, and I had heard that Catherine Graham had this contract to write her memoir from Random House, but that she wasn't really doing it, you know? And she brought this up. Did I have any suggestions? And I didn't have any suggestions because I get very tired of reading Washington memoirs. They're not a great form of, they're generally just self-aggrandizing books. Then she said something that I couldn't believe. We were seeing each other on a regular basis, and she said, whatever she said, I can't see you next Thursday because I have interviews of my own to do. So I said, what do you mean interviews of your own? And she said something like, I don't want this to be just another Washington memoir that's from my point of view. I want to know what else was happening in the room at that time. So I'm interviewing the other people, and I suddenly realized this is going to be a different kind of book. So I actually went back and told my editor that this was, you know, and he actually became her editor. And the result is this wonderful book of hers. I thought the world of her.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Tell us a bit about your work habits. LBJ has stayed the same. You've gotten 40 years older. How do you sustain that all journalists face this? How do you sustain the interest and the energy to keep doing what you're doing?
Well, it's not hard. I mean, it's fascinating because if you're interested in political power, I mean, this is a genius. I mean, you're learning me over and over again as doing these books. In this last book, how did he get the Civil Rights Act moving? You know, how did he get his tax cut bill moving when Congress was? There was just no. These bills were in committee and they were staying in committee, and the Southern Democrats, you know, controlled these committees absolutely, and they weren't let. Kennedy had put in his big economic bill, his tax cut bill in January. This was November 21st, let's say. The bill was still in the House Rules Committee. The chairman, Judge Howard W. Smith of Virginia, people asked him when he was going to hold hearings. He said, I have no plans to hold hearings. And it seemed like no one could make him hold hearings. And Civil Rights Bill was the same thing. Johnson tells Mrs. Graham on the telephone, we can't wait till Christmas. This is how the South does it. If this bill isn't in hearings before Christmas, this is the schedule. He's going to start he's going to talk about when to have the hearings in January. They're going to have the hearings in February, going over to March. It'll be April before they gets into the Senate. And if it's April before they gets into the Senate, Richard Russell can always filibuster long enough to stop the bill. It has to be, and he made people, so I'm learning things every day about
But your
John.
excitement creates the narrative. I mean, most of us would say, yeah, so, but you're still going at it. How do you maintain that sense of excitement? And what does a bad day look like for you? What is a bad reporting or writing day look like for you? You've got to lose interest on some days, or screw around, or do something, you know.
Well, there are a lot of really bad writing days. I mean, I read my stuff. The first thing every morning, I read what I wrote the day before.
In longhand, and you tend to write bare
I
minimum.
write the first 3 or 4 drafts in long, then I type.
Okay, and you tend to write a minimum of 1,000 words a day.
I try to write 1,000.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
And you get into, you have an office. Can you tell us a little bit about how you do this thing that you do? You have an office outside of the house.
Yeah. I don't know. I get up every morning. I put on, well, you know, I put on a coat and tie. I mean, people laugh at it, but the reason is my publisher is really wonderful with me. And he never asks me when I'm going to be done. There is no deadline. So my books take 7 or 8, or whatever. Let's just leave it at 7 or 8 years. So you're really in sort of a vacuum, and it's really easy to fool yourself that you're working hard when you're not. Mm-hmm. So that's just a trick. It's like, you know, you write every day how many words you wrote, because you need, and I wear a coat and a tie because when I was a reporter, I wore a coat and a tie. Everyone wore a coat and a tie then, I think. And they're all tricks to remind yourself you're going to a job, and you have to work. That's just a trick. That's it.
And how do you minimize distraction in your life? And how do you, when you look around you and see kids at Starbucks writing their thesis papers with Dr. Dre headphones on, they've got a stimulation coming at them from a million places. How do you minimize your own distraction and keep your concentration? And then when you look at others and the way they do things, what do you think, what kind of work will be produced with this overstimulation?
Well, I don't know about that. You know, it's probably too early, you know, for us to know what the answer to that. Everything's happening so fast. I turn off I don't get any phone calls.
You don't get any phone calls?
Well, I turn off I get phone calls, but I turn my machine off and put it on mute so I don't get any, you know, during the day.
Right.
I don't know that I do anything, you know, in particular.
And your use of the internet, email?
Well, I don't have email.
What about future Robert Caros, future biographers, when they have to deal also with Twitter, Facebook, email as documents? Do you think about how they might write their own scholarly historian work with?
Yeah, I think but you know, every technological change is significant at the time. Like with Johnson, it's long distance telephone rate. Like when Johnson first gets to Congress, or when he's a congressional secretary in the 1930s and the early 1940s, long distance telephone, you get all these telegrams. Call me, Lyndon, something's happened, call me tonight. Well, first, before that, I just started in the wrong place. Like, so it was all done by letters, right? The telegraph hadn't really become, and long-distance telephone calls were very expensive, so they wasn't used that much. So you get all these, like Johnson makes John Connally his administrative aide, and his job is to go around to the courthouses in the 10 counties in Johnson's district and write Johnson a letter every week about what's happening politically back in the district. And they are masterpieces because John Connally is really brilliant guy, and these letters are like 9 and 10 single-spaced pages long, and it's like a course in rural politics. And I mean, you say, why, you know, what keeps you interested? Well, this is fast. I grew up in a city. I didn't know what this is really fascinating, you know? And it's something we knew nothing about, you know, or I knew nothing about. Actually, I don't think many people in cities knew what rural politicking was like. And Connolly's letters, you have to do this, this is what matters, you know, don't mention Roosevelt here because this is what happened with this dam, you know, mention soil terracing here because of so-and-so, you helped John Halcombe. So that was great. Then all of a sudden, long-distance telephones become, so you have telegrams saying, call me, big trouble down in the Bay Strip, call me tonight. So you have to find a way of finding out what happened in that telephone call. So that, of course, is you try and interview Johnson, you try and interview Johnson's staff, and you try and interview John Connolly. I could interview Connolly. So you do it by interviews, and I'm sure there are going to be ways to find out stuff, even with this. There'd just be ways I don't know yet.
Who has not spoken with you over all these years? What holdouts are still alive?
Only one, Bill Moyers.
Okay. Why do you think that?
I don't really know. I can tell you what he says.
Okay.
I mean, I will say, it's not because he doesn't like my books. He's publicly said, you know, wonderful things about the books. You know, he says, but he won't talk to me. He says, for a while, he was writing, it was said he was writing his own book, but some time back, that's not the case. So now he says, what he says, and he said publicly, is, I have to get my own thoughts in order on Lyndon Johnson before I can tell them to someone else. But whatever the reason is, he won't talk. Every other Johnson person, even those who hadn't talked to me for the first 20 years, came around and talked to me.
And as you've published 4 volumes, and you've announced last year that you're going to go for a 5th. What sources are still alive? I mean, I mean, what your pool of sources has probably gotten smaller. So
It's gotten very small.
yes.
Well, that's the saddest thing, like, for me, because I became, you know, you become great friends with these people. Like, say, George Reedy was Johnson's press secretary, and Horace Busby was his speechwriter. And they, over the years, you know, you develop these relationships. One thing that's interesting about doing these books that take so long is these people become your friends. I mean, Busby went into the hospital, you know, and he had a stroke, and he came out, and he was sort of blind. So he wrote this letter, you know, where he says, he wrote it to Ina. He said, dear Ina, I'm out of the hospital now. All I could think of when I went in is now Bob won't have anyone to tell him about the vice presidency. Wow. So these guys were really helpful, and the great thing about them in terms of writing was you could pick up the phone. You didn't have to spend a long time schmoozing them. You could just pick up the phone and say to them, to Reedy, George, that interview Johnson, when he was talking with Wallace, was Johnson in the rocking chair or on the sofa? And Reedy would answer you, because he was a former newsman, the rocking chair. I'd say, thanks, and you just go back to typing. And over now, you find your hand reaching for the telephone, and there's nobody to call.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Let's open it up for some questions. If anyone wants to come up to the microphone, they're here, and they're here. We have 2.
Did you ever suspect that Johnson had a hand in the assassination of Kennedy?
In all the years I've been working on Lyndon Johnson, I never found any hint that he had anything to do with the assassination.
Mr. Caro?
Yes, sir. Sorry.
I'm Tyler Bridges. My question is kind of going back to process. It's an issue that I always struggle with myself is, do you have any specific techniques that you use to get people to open up to you so they will tell you what you hope is the truth? And then once you have that information and you've talked about befriending these people and liking them, and do you struggle within yourself knowing that you may put information out there that will make Johnson look bad or it may hurt them?
Well, I never talk to people off the record about the books. They know they know what they're telling me is for the books. I certainly, a lot of them don't like what I print, you know, or didn't. You know, they've all, it's very interesting, they've all, as I say, with this one single, I think everybody now, before they died, has become, are completely cooperative, you know, want to be part of these books and are very helpful. I always remind them, you know, if I feel that what they're saying to me is for a book. I don't know that I have any techniques except the thing I learned as a reporter. Well, the two things. Well, one is so obvious. You know, I never interview by telephone. I remember when I was a reporter, you know, sometimes you have to because you're on a deadline, you have the headset on and you're just in. But if you can, you want to see their faces because you learn so much from people's faces. I always try to type the interview. I don't tape anything. I take notes on every interview. One rule I have is no matter how late it is, I will type up that interview before I go to sleep because I want to have in my mind as fresh as possible what my impressions were, how he acted when he, you know, when he was saying things. I don't interview by, you know, I go back, I learned when I was a reporter, you know, if you just keep going back to people, interviewing them over and over again, the interviews just become completely different, you know. And the luxury I have, because I'm writing a book, is you can go back to people and become, you know, sort of friendly with them. So that's...
I'm curious. Because,
Yes, ma'am.
Because
So-
you use documents so much, and you also interview people over and over.
Yes,
What
ma'am.
have you learned about the reliability or unreliability of people's memories?
Totally unreliable.
So then how do you make sense of that when you're how do you know it was the rocking chair?
Yeah, good, yeah. That's a good question. I mean, you try to interview, well, you know, you try to interview, well, everybody who was involved. Like, it's a good, an easy example. The real decisions on Vietnam when Lyndon Johnson was president were made not in the cabinet or in National Security Council, but in something that Johnson called the Tuesday cabinet, which is every Tuesday at 1 o'clock he had lunch upstairs in the family dining room with just 4 people usually. McNamara sat on his right, and next to him was McGeorge Bundy, and Johnson fired him, Walt Rostow. The left was Dean Rusk. Then there was Earl Wheeler. So this isn't a good example because these people really were dead, and I couldn't do this. But whenever there's something, a room with 4 people, and what you would say, you interview all of them. And then you would go to Rusk and say, I'm just using names you know, this isn't a good example of it. McNamara says so-and-so, what was happening there? Then you'd go to Rostow and say what was happening there. Then you'd go back to McNamara and say, well, you say so-and-so, but Rusk says so-and-so. If you do that enough, like in the Senate, if you're trying to see what happened in the Senate in a committee, when I was doing that, they were all alive, the senators, the last of the senators. If you just make people go back and forth, even if there's no written record, it helps. And there's often a written record. If you combine them all, you know, and there's still a lot of things you're not sure of, and you say, but the only way of dealing with that is to try to keep looking for more records to show stuff, or interviewing the people over. Like if you're talking about Carl Hayden, so those of you who read Master of the Senate, so Hayden was a really crucial figure, you know. There's nothing in, you know, you say, well, where can I find out stuff about Hayden, you know? And you go to, you know, he has a collection of papers, and you look through them, and they're not really terribly valuable. But you say he was chairman of the Rules Committee, you know, so you go to the Senate historian, you say, you know, were there hearings of the Rules Committee? He says, yeah, but they've never been published, you know, so then it's your job to try and get to see them. So, you know, that these people, when the senators are on those hearings, they think nothing they say is ever going to be public. So you get a lot from that. And then you say, well, Hayden had administrative aides. He had this aide and that, and legislative aides. So you're really, there are a lot of people, or there used to be a lot of people, as Ann says, they're mostly dead, that you just try and go back over and over the same stories. I mean, Johnson was, you know, his key man in Texas was a name that no one even knew. His name was Edward V. Clark. In Texas, they knew him. He was known as the secret boss of Texas for like, I'm answering this. This is why my books take too long. I'm sorry. But he was, you know, he ran Texas for Lyndon. He was for like 25 years. And I must have asked him about the stolen election, you know, of 1948. And he had said, I'll tour. And we had become great friends. Every Sunday when we were in Austin, Ambassador Clark, became Johnson's ambassador to Australia, and his wife, Ann, and Ina and I would have dinner together every Sunday night. Ina's job was to keep Ann talking. Because Ann used to say, don't tell him that, Ann. But we became great friends, and we would drive to see, you know, Clark said, would you like to meet this guy? I'll go with you, you know. He was really saying, so the guy will talk to you. He said, the one thing I won't talk to you about is how Johnson's, that stolen election. And then I remember we were driving up to see a guy, and I said to him, you know, Ed, I'm about to write it now. If you don't tell me now, no one will ever know. And without another word, he just started telling me basically what is the story and means of ascent of how Johnson stole that election. I pulled over to the side of the road and took out my notepad. So if you just, you know, it's not that there's no great thing that I do. It's not particularly smart. It's just keeping doing it over.
Thank you. Amy?
I didn't hear you.
What are your plans for your book on Martin Luther King?
I don't. You asked me what are my plans for a book on Martin Luther.
I've read that your next book will be on Martin Luther King.
No, it won't. No, I'm not going to have time to do that, much as I would like to do that. So, yes, ma'am.
Yes, a lot of biographers, historians, when they set out writing a book, many of them say that they have to like the character. They have to have some kind of affinity for the character. Can you tell us, did you, for Johnson, and more importantly, did your feelings about him change over the process of reporting the book?
Johnson?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they keep, you know, he's such a complicated guy. I mean, on the one hand, he has this real compassion for people. I believe all his life he truly wanted to help poor people, and particularly poor people of color. On the other side, he's a man of really utter ruthlessness in getting things done, in rising to power, getting things done. So even now when you're writing, it's very hard to write. The hardest thing probably about doing these books is you keep thinking you're exaggerating. You know, you say, boy, this is just awful what he's doing here. And then you go back to your notes and you say, do you really have this? You know, did enough people, you know what I mean? On the other hand, you say, wow, look what he's doing now. You know, I mean, I didn't know you could do this. So you're filled with sort of an awe at this guy who could take, could really change, he wanted to change the world, and he did in a lot of ways. Thank you. Yeah. Yes?
Mr. Caro, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for your books. I'm a Canadian Nieman, so we watch pressed up against the glass. Everything the United States does affects us, and the Vietnam Wars years were particularly important for my generation. Johnson was a figure that fascinated us, and your portrayal of how the hill country of West Texas shaped him is vivid in my mind to this moment in helping to understand him. My question is, you just said you probably don't have time to write another book, but is there another figure who is so masterful at exercising power today that you would like to write about, who interests you the way Johnson did and Moses did?
Today? No one from today.
No one.
Wow. Today.
Would Johnson be able to wield power the way he did if he were here today?
Well, that's a good question. Anne asked me that before. There's a serious answer to that question. So when Moses, created power, he did something no one else had done before. He couldn't get elected, so he thought of another way of getting power, public authorities. Johnson did things in the Senate. Everyone said, no one can get anything through Congress. In 1963, Johnson, and 57, Johnson thinks of new ways that no one had done before. So I think part of the nature of a real political genius, of which there are not many, is that you find a way to do something when no one thought it could be done. So I think someone will come along and dominate the political process, but I don't know how it will be. Maybe I could, if he did it, I would be able to learn about it and describe it, but I think someone will come along. That's the nature. It always happens that way.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. You call on.
Yep,
Sorry.
okay.
As you were reporting, the tapes were released.
Yes.
Many of them confidential before.
Right.
What did they reveal that you had not seen in written documents and through interviews about his character?
Oh, a lot. Can you all hear the first place, a lot of the stuff isn't in writing anywhere. And you learn so much about how, it's one thing to say that Johnson could threaten and browbeat and control, but a lot of people can threaten and browbeat and control. What you learn so much from the tape. One of them is we all think Lyndon Johnson is always talking. He's not always talking. If he wants something, there's these long things where all the other guy is talking, a senator or a congressman, and all Johnson is saying is uh-huh, uh-huh. He's waiting to hear what he wants to hear, and when he hears it, you see how he uses it, like in this last book. So the Civil Rights Bill is stuck in the House Rules Committee. He needs Republican votes to get in the committee, to get it discharged from the committee. The Republican leader is Charles Halleck, and Halleck has said he has never voted for a discharge petition to get out of, and he never will, because it's violating the sacred rules of a committee chair. It's the sacred powers of a committee chairman. But we know what Johnson does with Halleck because there's a tape. Because while he's talking to Halleck, Johnson is listening to Halleck and listening to Halleck, and he realizes that what Halleck really wants is the largest employer in his district is Purdue University. And Purdue University has built new laboratories. They expected to get NASA grants, and they haven't gotten the grants. So Johnson, while Halleck is in the office, calls James Webb, who's the NASA administrator, and he basically says, I'm sending Charles Halleck over to you, and I want you to see what you can do for him. And then Halleck leaves the office, and Webb calls Johnson back and basically says, I sure hope that when he leaves here, he'll be happy. And you have to hear Lyndon Johnson's voice. He says, I'm not talking about hoping. I mean, you really hear what a G, there's a key vote on something else. There's he gets a call from George Smathers saying, God, we're going to lose in the Finance Committee. We got to change 3 votes. It's like, and Harry Byrd, the chairman of the Finance Committee, has called a recess, a luncheon recess. They're coming back at 2 o'clock. He says, and Johnson says, who are the 3 votes? And he says, Ribicoff and Frank Lausche and whoever. Johnson calls these 3 guys. Ribicoff says, and part of it is people feared Lyndon Johnson. People were afraid of Lyndon Johnson. They had learned you don't cross Lyndon Johnson. With Ribicoff, the call takes a matter of seconds. Ribicoff says something like, well, I can't change. I promised my constituents this. I'd lose face. Johnson says, you save my face today, I'll save your face tomorrow. And with Lausche, he knows the one thing that Lausche wants is, and he says that he'll take care of that. He changes these 3 votes in whatever I say in the book, 12 minutes or something like that. So the tapes are just great. Yes, sir.
Mr. Caro, again, thank you for being here. Look, this question. when you think about LBJ, you think about ruthlessness. You also think about pragmatism.
Yes.
You think about 1957 in terms of his formulation, the formulation of civil rights legislation at that time.
Yes.
And then, of course, 64, the passage of civil rights legislation.
Right.
What I'm wondering is, with this reputation for ruthlessness and pragmatism, how much did moral imperative figure into his decision to push this legislation along and finally to sign it into law?
Well, that's a great question. As I said before, I believe he always wanted to help poor people, and particularly poor people of color. How do I feel that I know that? So when Johnson is, forget if it's 20 or 21 years old, he's very poor. He's going to what he called the poor boys school, poor boys college, but he has to take a year off to earn money. So during this year, he teaches at what was called the Mexican school in a little town called Catula in South Texas. And I wrote that no teacher had ever cared if these kids learned or not. This teacher cared. It was very important to him. He felt it was very important that they learned to speak English. So he would just get enraged. He would spank boys and tongue lash girls if he heard them speaking in Spanish. And he would go, they were all the children of migrant workers, so he would spend days walking up and down the rows of these corrugated tin shacks that the migrant workers live in to persuade the fathers to take days off from work to drive their kids so they could have a debating team and baseball teams. But you could say that is not a moral imperative. You could say that's just an example of Lyndon Johnson always trying to do the best, most efficient job in whatever job he had, which was a characteristic of Lyndon Johnson. The reason I feel that I know he cared, that he had what you call a moral imperative, is that he didn't just teach the kids. He taught the janitor. The janitor's name was Tomas Coronado, and he wanted Coronado to learn English. So he bought him a textbook. And every day after school and before school, there were steps outside the school. He and Coronado would sit on the steps with the textbook, and Coronado says, Johnson would pronounce, I would repeat. Johnson would spell, I would repeat. I feel Johnson always truly wanted to do that, wanted to help.
Thank you.
Okay, this will be the last question.
I had the opportunity to do extensive interviews with Nick Katzenbach,
Yes.
who repeatedly told me that Johnson would say to him, get me out of this damn war. Does that sound like something Johnson would have said to Katzenbach repeatedly? And at what point do you think that Johnson realized that this damn war was going to destroy him?
Well, I think it's something that he definitely would have said to Katzenbach, because he was saying that kind of thing to everybody. Show me a way out of this war. But I don't think it's as simple as that. Johnson and the Vietnam War, I have to say, it's going to take me a lot of pages to try to talk about that, but I think that Johnson knew that the war was, he has the expression, that bitch of a war is killing the woman I love, the Great Society. So then you say, well, why didn't he stop escalating the war? And that takes a long time to answer. That's all I can say.
I think that's about it. One quick last thing. One of your mottos is, I believe that time equals truth.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for us who are working in this environment right now?
No, I think I sort of said it. You just keep going back in the interviews. That matters. That takes time.
Yeah.
To look at all these papers takes time. The one thing I didn't like I loved being a reporter, as I was telling you before, the one thing I really hated was you always had to write when you still had questions that you wanted to ask. And I just remember, I just hated that.
I bet. Thank you.